so much was upsetting about this to me personally. And so many of our fans reached out to describe visceral reactions. I don't remember this ever happening before. A piece of content coming out and people writing in to say it made them cry. It made them rage. It made them feel shame. They walked around with heaviness.
My guest today is Allison Josephs, the founder and executive director of Jew in the City, a non-profit organization that seeks to change negative perceptions of religious Jews and makes engaging and meaningful Orthodox Judaism known and accessible. Allison was named by Variety as an advocate for inclusivity in the entertainment industry in its 2022 Inclusion Impact Report, and having been quoted or written about in numerous publications, including Vanity Fair, The Wall Street Journal, and the New York Times, with appearances on numerous television and radio networks, including CBS, ABC, and NPR. Allison is very clearly letting people know that anti-Semitism in any form will not be tolerated. Allison, thank you so much for being here. How are you?
Thank you so much for having me. Doing great.
Well, look, I'm a big fan of what you guys do. A large part of your work focuses on combating the negative portrayal of Orthodox Jews, which manifests in the anti-Semitic tropes that make their way to film, television, and other media. What are some of the tropes that might be wielded against Orthodox Jews specifically?
I think the general way that we see Orthodox Jews depicted is extreme, insufferable, xenophobic, closed-minded. And that's not to say that those types of people don't exist. But when you only see dysfunctional and abusive people as the normative religious Jew, the religious Jew is kind of the stand-in for the Jew in general. If you go to Woody Allen in the movie Annie Hall, Annie Hall's grandmother sees Woody Allen, the completely secular Jew, as a chassid, because in the minds of non-Jews, we're all ultimately that kind of Jew. And so when there's this repeated negativity about sort of how extreme, awful, insufferable we are, and then we only get praised when we leave, that sort of the act of being less Jewish is when we've actually made it, when we've actually self-actualized. It's a really troubling dynamic. I mean, put that dynamic on any other minority community that you put un in front of it, un-Black, un-Hispanic. It's a really gross dynamic that you become celebrated when you become less of what you are.
Why do you think that the media does portray Orthodox Jews in this way?
There are not a small number of Jews in media. Hollywood was founded by Jews because of anti-Semitism. And so they started their own sort of thing out west. And a lot of them were running from their own, persecution. And when you're persecuted for being a Jew, that leaves you with a lot of complicated feelings about your relationship to your identity. And so I think in a lot of cases, people either leaving themselves and having complicated feelings, or people who have negative experiences often tell those stories. They go out to, the larger world to say how bad things were. What doesn't happen is the happy people who are living happy and healthy and meaningful lives as religious Jews, they're not contacting the New York Times or not contacting Netflix. They're kind of going about their business, living their best life. And so those stories don't get told. And there's also something salacious about all the drama. What I would like to see is, number one, less of a focus on, leaving as being celebrated, or if it's leaving is occurring, let's put that into the psychological dynamic. Let's talk about the psychological dynamics of mother and father in that family. Let's talk about abuse that occurred. Those are real things, but to just pretend that dysfunction and abuse is normative religious Judaism, it's not. It's when the system fails. It's when the family fails. And those stories are valid and they happen sometimes. Our organization works with people in that community. But that's the framework. It's not that Jews who are religious are automatically these awful people. And, I think we have to educate people in media about the stories that they don't know about, the framework that they're seeing these stories in, because it really does create a lot of hatred for Jews.
Mm. Now, your work also extends to combating tropes against Jews more generally, and you recently spoke out against the Netflix romantic comedy You People, in which a Jewish man and a black Muslim woman enter a relationship only to find that each person has trouble navigating the other's family. Many Jewish viewers found the film problematic, including Campaign Against Antisemitism, and we released a short movie review to our social platforms. Could you please give us a rundown of why you believe this film was so harmful to Jews?
Sure. I just want to first back up for a second and explain how our mission broadened to Jews in general beyond the original founding Orthodox mission. What we discovered in the last couple of years is that every minority group but Jews has had a Hollywood bureau, and most cases for decades, but at least for many years, where they work directly with studios to advocate for authentic and fair and sometimes proud representation of their community. And I was noticing that this was happening, but I didn't know why or how. A couple of years ago, when we discovered that this system was in place for everyone else, we sought out to build this at first for Orthodox Jews. We mistakenly believed that Jews are in Hollywood. Jews like Jonah Hill, for instance, are in Hollywood. Can't they tell their own stories? And what we found out from other Jews in Hollywood who were more proud and more knowledgeable was that they were also feeling powerless against the Jew as white trope, the anti-Semitic tropes built into so many TV shows and movies. And they were looking for a systematic way to push back and create better standards. And so we broadened our mission at that point to include sort of the three different buckets. The original one of sort of the depictions of Orthodox Jews as extreme or evil. The second one of the anti-Semitic tropes that are everywhere. And then number three, Jews only as, white privileged rich people and not, the broader Jewish story that, of course, we know that exists. My basic issue with You People, if I had to sum it up on one foot, is that Black culture is loved and celebrated, and the Black characters in the film are proud of who they are, which is great. It's great to be proud of your heritage. And Jewish culture is derided and disgusting, and no one Jewish in the film likes being Jewish. And I think it's in that dynamic that so many problems occur. In the opening scene, the Jews in the Yom Kippur services are all a bunch of perverts and weirdos. Almost like you meet a bunch of Jews in a building and you're going to be sexually harassed automatically. And of course, there's, the super rich, super white Jew, which again, this idea of Jewishness and whiteness, some of us are white passing. And as a people indigenous to the Middle East, to claim that we're white Europeans becomes so problematic. It cuts off our indigenous ties. We then have no place that we belong or homeland. It then, gives people like Whoopi Goldberg the room to say that the Holocaust was just white on white violence, just crimes of humanity, as opposed to understanding the fact that we've always been seen as this sort of lower ethnic group, racially impure, inferior. And then you get to outright conspiracy theories, blaming Jewish success on the slave trade as if we had some large part in that, replacing Jewish history of coming here, running from anti-Semitism and persecution and facing more persecution here, in most of the cases, low-level jobs, peddlers and factory workers, and, schmata sewers, replacing that with this fake history of doctors all the way back. We only see the Black character facing racism in the film. The Jew doesn't face racism. Instead, he faces connections. He can just call Rick Greenwald the family friend who is connected and get anyone a job. And this idea that it's almost a compliment. Oh, you people help each other out. That's how you people get ahead. You didn't actually have to work. You were, always successful. You have some Jew, part of your cabal, that gets each other jobs. And then there's the level of the Ezra Cohen character as just a really disgusting person who, if you watch him as a Jew, you feel embarrassed to be part of his tribe. He's a pathological liar. He's a yes man. We realized at the beginning that Amira doesn't like yes men, but Ezra is such a perfidious Jew that he's able to trick her, not Akbar. Daddy can tell his true colors, but he has tricked her. He lies when he proposes. He lies about knowing neighborhoods he doesn't know. He lies about not doing cocaine, and then his cocaine dealer uses Yiddish. We find out that he goes to Vegas to get prostitutes, to do drugs, and he's such a putz that he soils himself. And what's the, like, how do they defend him in that scene? Oh, I didn't soil my pants due to drugs. I did it due to Chipotle. Oh, well, that makes everything better. He's a yutz and a putz, and we feel gross watching him sort of exist in this world. He is then called out by Akbar at the end. And then when Akbar decides not to publicly humiliate him, Ezra is so grateful for him that he, chose to spare him, at which point we learn it was for his daughter, not for him. This conversation around Shelley and Amira around black hair. That's not to say that a Jewish person couldn't, participate in tokenism. I'm sure that has happened before. Although I'm not here to comment on the black experience watching that. That's not my culture. So I can't say what that feels like as a black person to watch that. But what I will tell you is the conversation about black hair, with Shelley having no knowledge of kinky, curly, frizzy hair that is sometimes called the Jewfro, at least in America. That's a point of like pride for a lot of Jews that connect to Judaism in an ethnic way. Actually, you kind of look like you have a little bit of a Jewfro there yourself. So the fact that Shelley is sort of this white Aryan wasp that they sort of make her out to be, that has no idea about kinky or curly hair at all, again, erases our indigenous, origin in a place not too far from where Amira comes from. And then, of course, like the, apology at the end on behalf of all white people, on behalf of all Jewish people, like, for what? Like, we have been historic allies. We have been persecuted and oppressed, not exactly in the same way, but in ways that we can understand each other's pain. So much was upsetting about this to me personally. And so many of our fans reached out to describe visceral reactions. I don't remember this ever happening before. A piece of content coming out and people writing in to say it made them cry, it made them rage, it made them feel shame. They walked around with heaviness. This seemed like different than other movies that have come out, to be honest.
I completely agree, and we haven't even gotten on to the use of the repeated Holocaust jokes and the normalization of Louis Farrakhan's repeated. He's, for those who may not know, he is an anti-Semitic hate preacher from the Nation of Islam who has said things such as, "I'm not an anti-Semite, I'm just an anti-termite, and I'm here to separate the good Jews from the satanic Jews." And the father of the main character, one of the main characters, is a big supporter of his, and it's not really challenged, which I thought was quite surprising.
It's not challenged, and in real life, the leading lady, Lauren London, dated a rapper named Nipsey Hussle for many years, had a child with him. A few years ago when he was killed, the main eulogizer at his funeral was Louis Farrakhan. Yes, Lauren London is close with Kenya Barris, who made the film. So while I've heard some say this was meant to be a repudiation of Farrakhan, meant to make a Nation of Islam follower look ridiculous, I didn't see that. More than a little bit of sort of light poking fun at. And the people in real life have actual ties to Louis Farrakhan. And while that doesn't necessarily prove it, it certainly raises some flags. It certainly begs some questions to be asked. In fact, the contempt that I was feeling off of the screen, and I think what I just described, other people were feeling as well. And sometimes when you experience something, you're not sure, did I imagine that? Is this a real thing that I just felt? It's sort of a confusing thing when it's weird to say that watching a movie could be traumatic, but it felt a little bit traumatic to me. I found myself sort of processing what I saw sort of hours and days later. Did they really do that to the Jewish character? Did they say that? I decided to start reading Farrakhan to see, like, is there some more Farrakhan messaging in this movie than what we realized, besides the slave trade, besides the Holocaust denying? And what I saw is that Farrakhan blames Jewish movie moguls for making black characters denigrated, degraded, looking silly. And this made me wonder, is this movie payback? Is this movie revenge to make the Jews in the film, degenerate and degraded and just awful characters? So now, he can have his turn to get the Jews back.
I sincerely hope it's just lazy writing and nothing else, because if it is that, that is horribly, horribly concerning. And I have to ask you, Allison, why do you think it is that so many anti-Semitic tropes manage to end up in the final edits of films and TV programs? Is it laziness, embedded anti-Semitism, or something else?
So I think, to quote David Badiel, Jews don't count. And sort of, look, there's a Madoff film that just came to Netflix that put horns and pointy ears and a red background on Madoff in the artwork. Do people not? And it was done by a Jew. Do people not know about the horns trope? Why doesn't it matter? Do they not realize that thousands-year-old tropes are really problematic and sort of further boister anti-Semites in their conviction? It's really hard to unpack. Is the self-hatred so embedded? Is the same shame so embedded that people can't tell the difference? Do they think it doesn't matter? Everyone knows it's a joke. No one would think I meant it to be anti-Semitic. It's really, with our bureau now, we're actually starting to have these conversations with the writers and the filmmakers about how did you come to do this? Why did you not think it was problematic? Let's not go in accusing you of horrible things, but let's maybe just make a baseline of lines we don't cross. I'm hearing people say, I'm anti-censorship, which is great, but do they say that for blackface too, or for Muslims as terrorists? If there's this new standard now of we just don't do these things for other groups, why can't Jews also say these are the things you don't do for us? Even if you don't think it's damaging, how about we just don't do that anymore? So I think it's both highlighting, like witches and goblins are also anti-Semitic tropes, which are so embedded in Western culture. We don't realize that 1,000 years ago, the pointy nose entered Western art as a way to make the Jew look evil. And the 1267 Church Council made Jews wear pointy hats as a form of anti-Semitism. And so large hook nose and pointy hat together created the witch. Little man with large nose, hovering over his money is the Jew that became the goblin motif. So these things are so embedded in Western art, media, literature, that we don't even recognize the Jewish origin. So it's really about becoming educated about this history, which I'm working to do right now to understand how much has gone wrong and, talking about it, letting people know so they can spot it and they can demand better.
Well, when we talk about it and we start to unpack these tropes, it's really worrying how many can just fly by without us even realizing. Can you, we've just spoken quite a bit about you people. Can you give some other examples of shows or movies where you feel that Orthodox Jews or Jews more generally have been poorly or stereotypically or ignorantly portrayed in potentially harmful ways?
Yeah, sure. I mean, the truth is that I was paying attention to the Orthodox depictions for a much longer time. Since I started paying attention to Jewish tropes in general, it's definitely troubling. If you take Never Have I Ever, Mindy Kaling, it's a fun show on Netflix. I enjoy watching it. The Jewish character is, again, super white, super privileged, super shallow, super dysfunctional family, kind of cutthroat and trying to get ahead. Yes, he is humanized at certain points of the show. We do come to see, something beyond the stereotype as well. But there are some rough, scenes, especially earlier on, that are just really hard to watch and I feel like unnecessary. And again, stop always going with that angle. If you want to, handle the Indian community as an Indian writer, you can deal with the haters in your community not liking those, those representations, but don't do that for the Jewish character. Another show that I did not watch, but I heard about, Do Revenge, also Netflix. They make a lot of content. The sort of super white, super rich, super misogynistic character that they want to do revenge on, for some reason, needs to wear a Jewish star and use words like kvel and, schlep. Completely unnecessary. Like, why add that in there? In Cobra Kai, also really loved that show. The Terry Silver character, that name is from decades ago, so I can't blame the writers, who are Jewish, by the way, for that being his name today, because there is more awareness about, minority representation. But once I realized, again, super rich, super white, super devious, maniacal, all powerful type of character, once I realized his name is Terry Silver, I was like, oh, please don't do anything with the Jewish angle. Please just leave that as a question and don't go there. And then there's an episode where Shabbat services are discussed. During Shabbat services, he's making a deal with someone. And then at the end, he tells the guy, shalom. So it's kind of just like, geez, like we're always this certain type. Another one, Law and Order. NBC also has some issues. Law and Order has the Israeli character who is greedy and scummy. And when he realizes his colleague is skimming off the top, he literally punishes him by dipping him in molten gold. We find his enemy's skull in this like smelter, a skull covered in gold. This is what Jews do. They love money so much, as Joe Rogan will let us know. We'll do anything for money. We even use money as our weapon. Those are some of the non-Orthodox tropes. In the Orthodox genre, again, the continuous unorthodox shows over and over again. Unorthodox, Mine Orthodox Life, Mine Orthodox Life 2. Khanchi is the latest show that just premiered at Netflix. I'm sure that's coming to a platform soon by you. You have a character, Isidore Latham, on Chicago Med, the first non-Hasidic recurring character. I mean, probably the first recurring Orthodox character anywhere who actually was not Hasidic, which is huge because they're always Hasidic. They also gave him another identity, Black, and they also gave him another identity, Asperger. So that's really 3 different minority identities on one person, which is really a lot to try to like unravel and even understand. The showrunners describe him as someone really difficult to get along with. He does a lot of rules. And at that point, we have to wonder, is that because of the Asperger's piece or because of the Jewish piece? And it's sort of hard to understand. They note that the man that he replaces was beloved. He was a father figure, but this is a really difficult guy to get along with. And I think what bothers me is that I don't watch this show as a regular, thing that I watch, but I've seen some of it to try to understand this character. There are several Black characters on this show who are just kind of regular people, part of the team, a range of, emotions, characteristics, sort of what you'd expect. Putting this guy in with so many different identities inside of him, it just makes him like extra weird and hard to understand. And really what I'm looking for is someone who could be like outwardly or visibly Jewish, outwardly and visibly practicing Judaism, and not some weirdo, and not made fun of or making fun of himself for doing those things. I love what Muslim Pack Hollywood Bureau did with Jack Ryan. They have a Black Muslim character. He's not perfect. He has a bit of a temper. He curses sometimes, but he goes off in the middle of the day to pray the afternoon service. And he's not fighting Islam. He is finding spiritual enlightenment from it. We never see Jews doing that. And I think it's because there are so few Jews in Hollywood who have that relationship with Judaism themselves. And so they don't even know how to write that in there. Or the ones that do, that want to have those characters or those shows happen, they're not getting greenlit by executives. And so even for the ones that want to write these stories, there's no framework for those stories to be executed currently.
Gosh, I mean, when you lay it out like that, it's sort of a bit depressing. I think the worst one for me was Terry Silver, because I love The Karate Kid, and I don't want to have to stop loving The Karate Kid.
So it's depressing. What I feel hopeful about is that these other bureaus have led the way. So the map has already been written, and what we need to do now is follow the map and follow the work the other groups have done. We have a bit of a high bar to get started on here. It has not escaped me that we're a small organization. Our annual budget is about $250,000. There are obviously much bigger entities out there that have not done this. Why not? Because to go to Hollywood and have this conversation, first, as an Orthodox Jewish woman, we have basically no representation in the room when our stories are told. So that's basically calling them out and saying a rule that the Native American group came up with, about us and without us. You're completely being hypocritical that you're telling stories without us in the room. Cultural specificity matters. You can't just put a Jew in the room and tell a story about Orthodox Jews. We need to be in the room as our stories are being told. I also feel like I need to prove my humanity. There is so little humanity in depictions of Orthodox characters that to show that you can be, in the world with it, educated, relatable, is news. It's such a chiddush to so many people working in media that someone like me even exists, that there's a whole world of people like me that exists. And then the second piece is that Jews belong in this conversation. The all-powerful, all-privileged, all overrepresented Jews are actually at the same time, despite that sort of trope about us, are experiencing a sense of voicelessness, a lack of power, and serious frustration with these tropes. And so I feel like we really have to go in there and like do a bit of a battle to prove that we deserve to be in the room, to prove that we deserve to be at the table. Now, I'm not someone who's like a belligerent person for no reason, but at the same time, like I'm ready to fight for our people, and tell the story of the Jewish people through a progressive lens. All the language that is being used for these other marginalized groups to describe their oppression and persecution, we've now begun using that language to describe the Jewish people. And I would say that we're generally a proud people. We don't like to, kind of like sit around and focus on what went wrong, because there's a lot of what went wrong. And we also know that more could come, God forbid. That is also part of the Jewish experience, the sense of foreboding of what the future will look like, the lack of stability, where will we run next? At the same time, if we don't advocate for ourselves and tell our story in terms that people in these diversity, equity, and inclusion spaces can understand, they will have no reason to include us. And so if we can cogently make the argument for why we belong here and then do the things that they do, we're about to launch or commission an impact study with a leading entertainment academic group. Every other group has done this. First, they'll do an in-depth character analysis. What we expect to find is that we'll see these tropes that, we're feeling anecdotally shown with, a high percentage. Then from there, they take the content and they put it in front of viewers to measure how the content makes viewers think about Jews, how it makes non-Jews think about Jews, how it makes Jews think about ourselves, think about the shame that, comes about when we see these awful depictions. And then they, at the end of the study, they bring the findings to the media executives and report them and give them recommendations on how to do a better job to not endanger the Jewish community.
Well, it sounds like it's going to be a tremendously significant study. And you recently made history by hosting the first ever panel on Jewish representation at the Sundance Film Festival. Can you tell us about why Sundance is so significant and what was this experience like for you?
Yeah, so when I decided that I'm going to launch this bureau, I'll tell you just a quick story of how the bureau came to be. I was, like I said, seeing increasing positive depictions, non-stereotypical depictions of other groups. And then every Jewish story was, full of tropes or a rejection of our culture. And just trying to make sense of how could there be progress for other groups and not the Jews. And then the features editor at Variety, who was actually my co-panelist at our Sundance panel, wrote this excellent article in Variety about how tropes and stereotypes in TV and movies are increasing Jew hatred, increasing violence against Jews. I reached out to her and I said, Melina, this is excellent. What should we do? And she was feeling a little bit, I think, hopeless at that point, kind of like, everyone will read this, no one will do anything, kind of like, nobody's going to kind of upend the system. And I said, I will. But I didn't know what to do, though. What should I do? And then in passing, she just mentioned this woman to me, Sue Obeidi. She writes good things about Muslims. I think she must have thought that I knew about the Hollywood Bureau framework as a thing. I did not. Most people outside of the entertainment industry do not. I Google her and my jaw hits the ground. There's this entire Muslim-backed Hollywood Bureau, relationships with every studio. They're consulting for their own stories. They're putting Muslim writers in the room when their stories are told. They're going to places like Sundance. And I'm both in awe and also super jealous. What do they know that we don't know? I thought we control Hollywood. I hop on over to Instagram to tell our fans, I can't believe that the Muslim community has done this. Someone's got to start this for the Jews. And as I'm trying to tag them, I accidentally tagged NAACP Hollywood Bureau. I'm like, wait a second, the Black community has this too? At this point, I go over to Google and I Google Asian Hollywood Bureau. I discover CAPE, CAPE. And at that point, I realized every group has this. They all have 4 letters. We're JITC. Perfect. Once I knew that everyone did it, I knew that no one did it for the Jews because nobody wanted to have that fight. And I said, I can do that. And I started meeting the bureaus. And as I started meeting the bureaus, I learned what their programming was. I learned what they charge for consulting. I learned how they go about doing their work. And I started getting connected to the people in the entertainment industry and the diversity, equity, and inclusion groups. So why did we go to Sundance? Because the other groups go to Sundance. That's it. We are going to the places that the other groups go to say, oh, hi, hello, can we also have a seat at the table? You forgot the Jews. Why, besides that, was Sundance good and significant? Because we spent the last year meeting the TV studios to tell them about the work that we're doing and why we have to be included. And we had never really had a conversation with the film world. And what I quickly learned as we were preparing for Sundance and seeing who I could network with was that basically none of my television contacts had any film contacts. It's very different worlds. And that if we want to have the movie world treat Jews differently, we need to have a presence there, and we need these issues to be known. We need to be flagged. So one of the things we're doing besides the study is that we're developing a fact sheet with Think Tank for Inclusion and Equity. This is a group of TV writers who formed this group on a volunteer basis to try to make the situation for marginalized groups better in storytelling. When we got there, they had 15 different minority categories. They did not have a Jewish category. When we met with them, they agreed to do a Jewish one, and we've been building the fact sheet now. We've brought in other experts in, the anti-Semitism space, the Jewish space, and we're going to now, pretty soon, God willing, have this beautiful fact sheet, which I think the most important parts are the columns which say tropes we're tired of and what we want to see more of. Because I think, and again, I looked at what the other groups had as their categories. There was a category called Black pain and suffering that only, comes to an end when the white character saves the Black character from their awful life. And I'm thinking, I recognize that. Orthodox Jewish pain and suffering. If we just get left with those awful Jews in the shtetl, life is bad. If the Gentile comes in and frees us from our, cursed Jewishness, then life can be good. There's so many categories that fit, and so we are using their language to describe the Jewish experience. We're bringing in a range of Jewish voices across the denominational board, across the Jewish ethnic board, because we want this to be a broad range of voices so that we can, explain the diversity of what Jewish experiences look like.
That is so cool. Allison, I got to ask you, what is the ultimate goal for Jew in the city?
It's a great question. We didn't even talk about our 2 other bureaus. We have 2 other bureaus. The Hollywood Bureau lives inside of our Keter arm. We formed Keter as that was our original Jew in the City branch, media related, but we gave it the name Keter to be able to differentiate the other pieces that we do. Keter restores the crown of the good name of the community through media in general. And the Hollywood Bureau is kind of our hottest, program right now within Keter. We have our Makom branch that helps displaced Haredi Jews find a positive place in the observant Jewish world. The interesting thing is that we're dealing with anti-Semitism from without in most cases, although kind of a Jonah Hill type of character. Sometimes there seems to be some internalized anti-Semitism. The Makom cases, which, by the way, these stories of leaving, media is obsessed with that. And so getting to work with hundreds of people from this community has given me so much more insight on how the stories, I believe, should be told if they're going to be told in authentic and accurate ways. But in a lot of cases in the Haredi ultra-Orthodox world, these are Holocaust survivors or children of survivors, great-grandchildren. The Hasidic community was nearly 100% survivors or descendants of survivors and got basically put into a closed system after the war because everybody was so terrified. In the black hat Lithuanian yeshivish crowd, either they got out before the war in the 1800s or they were killed on the spot. I believe it was about 30,000 Lithuanians were just killed like at home there when the Holocaust made its way through. And then some other people in the yeshivish Lithuanian community are descendants of Hasidic Jews, so more of that Holocaust trauma. What I believe is this dysfunction that we see in parts of these communities is in large part due to the Holocaust. And so here we have Jews that are now experiencing a trauma filter of being Jewish due to Jew hatred from a couple generations ago, then in some cases they leave. They believe their experience of being Jewish is the experience of being Jewish, tell those stories to the media, get fed back now to the media, which then makes Jewish people even more hated, make us hate ourselves even more. Our third branch is called Tikkun, which is actually dealing with some of those systemic issues that hit the community and brought us down due to systemic Jew hatred. And so we're kind of from every angle dealing with the systemic issues behind closed doors with Haredi leadership, where we can say we see the beauty in this culture and community. We see incredible acts of kindness. We see beautiful, close-knit families, and the best that, can be offered here. And also, there are some issues that must be dealt with. And if we don't, people will continue to have abusive Jewish experiences and will continue to leave and then share those stories with the media. You don't want that. The Makom, division is really helping people process, separating the trauma from Jewishness so that they can see that a trauma healing journey is different than being a Jew. And that if your questions were silenced, if you were taught some crazy things in the name of Torah, let's separate those things out. Let's find you healthy people instead of toxic people. Anyone that hangs out with toxic people is going to not enjoy anything they're doing. Toxic people ruin things. And then bring that insight then to the media to tell a more nuanced story. And so, yes, we want to essentially change people's perceptions about sort of our traditions ultimately. Those of us who keep the traditions, in a religious and observant way. Let me just make it clear. A Jew is a Jew is a Jew. You can't stop being a Jew no matter what you do or don't believe or do or don't practice. But sort of the practice of living Jewishly sort of ends up representing Jewishness in our culture in a very specific way. And I believe that everyone gets to make their decision about how much or how little they want to engage with those traditions or teachings. But at the same time, they should have accurate information. They should be able to have the toxicity, the abuse, and sort of the angling that media does or sort of projects onto Jewish traditions and culture, honest and authentic, so we can understand what is abuse, what is dysfunction, what do our sources say at their most basic root, because then you can actually engage with our traditions and our sources from a place of at least honesty to know how much you do or don't want. Until we have all those kind of layers stripped away, do we even know what we're rejecting? So that's what we're trying to do, sort of come at it from the different angles so that this information is available, it's accessible, as you read in the founding mission statement, for Jews to engage with and know what they're dealing with.
Mm. What do you wish the wider public knew about Orthodox Jews?
You have to meet some. Instead of just relying on the depictions you see on TV shows and movies and news headlines. They always capture the crooks, creeps, and extremists of the community. And also, if you met one and they were a jerk, probably we don't like them either. Seek out to find an Orthodox Jew who has a sense of humor, who, is a person with wisdom, who is a person who's healthy. Those are the people who I would say are accurately representing Jewish tradition. We don't get to, remove their Orthodox card or tag if they do something abhorrent. You don't get to choose who your co-religionists are. And sometimes a single meeting with a person in a minority group could make someone think that's the whole community. And also recognize that, Jews can also be anti-Semites, that, you may be holding so much sort of hatred of your fellow Jew, which is a problem. We're the most sort of visible Jews. And so there's a big target on our backs in terms of violence, in terms of how people behave or misbehave and what that represents on all of us. And I think there's some idea that if we just sort of blend in, if we do less Jewish stuff, if we look less Jewish, we can finally be off the hook for people hating us. That's not true. They come after us first, but they come after everyone eventually. Tom Stoppart's Leopoldstadt, I think, is one of the best modern expressions of that dynamic. And I think for some Jews, they feel a certain shame of that Jewishness being so out there in public. And I think that's the thing that someone who feels those feelings needs to do some soul searching about where that comes from. Because that's how I was raised. I was raised to hate this group of people. And I didn't even know any. It was more just like the things I heard, the things I read, and meeting some lovely Orthodox Jews changed my life and the life of my entire family. We all became observant.
That's lovely. Now, we've spoken a lot about the damaging and anti-Semitic tropes that are often seen in film and TV. Could you please recommend to our listeners some films or television programs that depict Jews in a positive light?
Yeah, this is where my list gets short. Look, I'm watching Fauda right now with my husband. This is probably the most authentic depictions of Jews on TV that I've ever seen before. Simply because the thing about like the Jews of Fauda, yes, it's a specific Israeli story, but they're like secure, like in themselves. They know who they are. The characters are nuanced. They're deep on both sides. The conflict is given over in just a really heartbreaking and human way. But these are not, the Jews with trembling needs. These are Jews who live in their land, are defending their land, and who know who they are as Israeli Jews. So that's really a pleasure to watch. Shtisel has a humanization of Haredi Jews, which has really never been done before this show. I particularly like season 3 because what I see in season 3 is a push and pull of some of the more younger and progressive voices in the community saying like corporal punishment isn't allowed anymore, or I'm going to get my driver's license, or just sort of changes that are happening organically in the Haredi community. It allows you to see what those conversations taking behind closed doors look like. Humanizing Haredi Jews is obviously super important. My issues with Shtisel is that it's yet another ultra-Orthodox show, and people like me who are centrist or modern are never depicted on TV, and so it's hard for people outside the community to know the difference. The other thing I would say is that my dog also has a message right now. The other thing that I would say is that everyone in Shtisel is dysfunctional, and that is what happens when there is a soap opera. Soap operas have to be dysfunctional, but people don't realize in many cases that soap operas are not real life. So one of my good friends who's a Reformed Jew wanted to know about 16-year-olds getting married. And I had to explain to her that's not a real thing. Just because you saw it on TV doesn't mean it's real. So that's the thing that like you have to also take it with a grain of salt. My friend Mayim Bialik made a movie, As They Made Us, where the characters say Shema every night before bed. That's what they did in her household growing up. And so I had never actually seen Shema on a movie before that just felt so authentic and real. And although it's not a huge part of the show, she just weaved in Jewishness in a way that I want it to be weaved in, where you're not running from it, you're not embarrassed by it. It's just part of who you are and you don't talk about it. Nissim Black has a show coming out on HBO Max. It's not out yet, but I am hopeful that that will be something great because he's a terrific guy. But the list is not long, and my dog agrees.
Alison, as we begin to wrap up, I've got to ask you a question that I ask all of our guests. If someone who is not Jewish approaches you and says that they want to help in the fight against anti-Semitism, where should they start?
So I think that everyone has the opportunity to be an ally in their own circle of influence. Read books like People Love Dead Jews, Jews Don't Count. Go to jewinthecity.com to read what we're saying about anti-Semitism. Once you are knowledgeable about what the issues are, you can then start being an ambassador in your world to point out tropes, to call out friends who are being anti-Semitic. If you're at a diversity, equity, and inclusion event, say, hey, where are the Jews? Why do you include them? I think that's really a huge thing. You need first some information, which is ammunition, and then you need to use your voice. And I think, what we've proven here at Jew in the City is that you can be a small guy with a big voice and a lot of passion and make some significant changes. And I think everyone should recognize that they also have the ability to have, a sphere of influence in their own life and in the people that they touch. And don't go through life not knowing, don't go through life not speaking up. We all have a responsibility. And let me just say, not just for Jews, we should all be speaking up for every group's dignity, every group being respected. If we want this for ourselves, then we have to be allies to other groups. Ultimately, we do better when we all lift each other up. And I guess I would say in closing, getting back to that awful movie, it just seemed like it just ripped down everyone. And there are such better ways to handle some of these thorny questions or conversations or issues that come up between communities. We can have honest conversations. I do this all the time, but not in a movie like this.
Yeah. Allison, please tell our listeners, where can people find you and what have you got coming up?
Look up Jew in the City on pretty much every social media platform is where you can find us. In terms of what's coming up next, we, God willing, will be launching or commissioning this minority impact study soon. And we hope to get some, some nice publicity around that. This fact sheet that we're building also should be ready soon. We're hoping the fact sheet will turn into trainings of showrunners. So we'll be able to go into the studios now and meet with the showrunners directly and flag for them what blind spots they have so they prevent the next, garbage take on Jews from coming out. So that's going to be some legwork for us. And hopefully you'll know that our work is working when the depictions stop being so bad and start getting better.
That's awesome. Allison Josephs, thank you so much for coming on Podcast Against Antisemitism.
Thanks so much for having me.